If you've noticed that your erections aren't just weaker than they used to be, but that they're measurably worse than they were 6 months ago, and worse than that compared to a year ago, you're experiencing something that most men don't realize is happening. This isn't random fluctuation. This is progressive deterioration. Your prostate inflammation is creating cumulative damage that compounds month after month. And every 30 days, you wait to address this, the destruction accelerates. What feels like gradual decline is actually exponential progression. Let me explain why this gets worse on a predictable timeline, what's being permanently damaged with each passing month, and what interrupts this progression before you cross into irreversible territory. Here's what progressive means in this context. Your prostate doesn't swell to a certain size and then stop. Chronic inflammation is a self-perpetuating cycle. Inflammation causes tissue swelling. Swelling creates pressure on surrounding blood vessels. Reduced blood flow to the area worsens inflammation. Worse inflammation causes more swelling, and the cycle intensifies continuously. Every month, your prostate is slightly larger than the month before. Every month, the compression on blood vessels supplying your penis is slightly tighter. Every month, blood flow to erectile tissue is slightly more restricted. This isn't a plateau. This is an accelerating cascade. Think of it like a slow leak in a dam. At first, water drips through a tiny crack. The crack doesn't stay the same size. Water pressure gradually widens it. As it widens, more water flows through. More water creates more pressure. The crack expands faster. Eventually, what started as a drip becomes a stream, then a flood. Your prostate inflammation is that crack. The damage to erectile function is the widening breach. And every month you ignore this, the rate of deterioration increases. This explains the timeline pattern most men experience, but don't consciously track. Year 1, you might notice erections are slightly less firm than they used to be. Maybe once or twice a month, you have difficulty. Year 2, those occasional difficulties become weekly occurrences. The firmness that was slightly reduced is now noticeably compromised. Year 3, achieving adequate erections requires deliberate effort and favorable conditions. By year 4 or 5, medications that would have worked earlier become less effective because the underlying vascular damage has progressed beyond what pharmaceutical intervention can overcome. Here's what's being destroyed during this progression. Erectile tissue requires regular blood flow to maintain structural integrity. When blood flow is chronically restricted from prostate-induced vascular compression, the tissue doesn't just sit there waiting. It undergoes permanent remodeling. Smooth muscle cells that create rigidity are gradually replaced by fibrous tissue that doesn't expand. Elastic fibers that allow engorgement, degrade, and don't regenerate. The microvasculature within erectile chambers becomes less dense as small vessels collapse from disuse. Each of these changes makes the next month's function worse than this month's, creating a downward spiral that accelerates over time. The nerve pathways controlling erections undergo similar progressive damage. Chronic compression doesn't just block signals temporarily, it causes structural changes to nerve tissue. The myelin sheath protecting nerve fibers gradually degrades under sustained pressure. Signal transmission speed decreases month by month. Eventually, the nerves themselves can undergo permanent damage, where even if compression is later relieved, full signal transmission capacity never returns. You're not just losing function, you're losing the biological capacity to regain function. Most men dealing with progressive erectile decline try intermittent solutions that don't address the underlying acceleration. They use medications sporadically when they anticipate sexual activity. Those might work initially, forcing blood vessel dilation despite compression, but the medications aren't reducing prostate inflammation. They're not stopping the progressive tissue changes. They're not preventing nerve damage. They're temporarily masking symptoms of a problem that's getting exponentially worse underneath. And eventually, many men find that the same medications that worked a year ago barely help now, because the cumulative damage has progressed beyond what those interventions can compensate for. This is educational information to help you understand the progressive nature of this condition. It doesn't replace medical guidance, but recognizing the timeline helps inform better decisions. Here's why timing matters so critically. There's a window where tissue damage is still reversible. When blood flow restriction is moderate and tissue changes are early-stage, comprehensive intervention can allow recovery. The smooth muscle hasn't been completely replaced by fibrous tissue yet. The microvasculature can regenerate if adequate flow is restored. Nerve compression hasn't caused permanent structural damage yet, but that window narrows with every passing month. Most men who wait until function is severely impaired discover they've crossed from reversible compression into irreversible damage without realizing the threshold existed. So what actually interrupts this progressive cycle? The only approach that works is addressing prostate inflammation comprehensively, enough to not just slow the progression, but reverse it. When chronic inflammation is reduced at the cellular level, prostate size decreases instead of increasing. When size decreases, vascular compression eases instead of intensifying. When compression eases, blood flow to erectile tissue improves instead of declining. And when adequate blood flow returns, tissue that was deteriorating can begin recovering instead of continuing to degrade. But this requires intervention that's stronger than the inflammatory cascade driving progression. Partial approaches that reduce inflammation slightly might slow the deterioration, but won't reverse it. What's needed is comprehensive support that addresses every mechanism perpetuating the cycle. Natural compounds that actively reduce inflammation in prostate tissue. Ingredients that break the feedback loop between swelling and vascular restriction. Support for tissue repair and regeneration. Protection against ongoing oxidative damage. When all of these work together at sufficient intensity, the progressive cycle can be interrupted and reversed. Most men who address this properly, while still within the reversible window, notice a specific pattern. The first change is typically that decline stops. Erectile function, that was getting measurably worse month after month, stabilizes. That usually happens within 4 to 6 weeks as inflammation begins decreasing. Then around week 8 to 12, most men notice function starting to improve instead of continuing to decline. Erections that were getting weaker begin getting firmer again. The timeline reverses. By month 4 to 6, many men report erectile function has recovered to levels they hadn't experienced in years, because the progressive damage was interrupted before permanent changes occurred. Expectations need to be realistic about the timeline. This didn't develop in weeks, and it won't reverse in weeks. But the critical factor is interrupting the progression now, while recovery is still possible, rather than waiting until the cumulative damage crosses into irreversible territory. Every month of continued inflammation is another month of accelerating deterioration that narrows your window for recovery. Below, you'll find information about an approach designed to comprehensively address prostate inflammation and interrupt progressive vascular damage. When the inflammatory cycle driving monthly deterioration is properly reversed, erectile function typically stabilizes within 6 weeks and progressively improves over 3 to 6 months, rather than continuing to decline. Have you noticed erectile function getting progressively worse over the past year?